the origins of the Wicklow Library services, both in Bray and in the county, really they trace back to the Carnegie services, which were set up in the early part of the century, both Bray and Greystones, and indeed in Enniskerry, coming into being in about 1910 or 1911. They're named after Andrew Carnegie, who was a significant and a very wealthy Scottish-American philanthropist, probably something akin to Bill Gates. In his time, his family had emigrated from Scotland, from Dunfermline, to the States in the 1830s or 1840s, I suppose, mid-19th century, and extraordinarily, successful, largely through his intelligence and ability as a telegraph boy to pick up little ideas about the stock market and very good hearing things being said and maybe making some gains, and then himself setting up a substantial and very lucrative business in the iron and steel area, which made him an absolute fortune, of course, the period of the Civil War. And he decided to give it all away, and an area which he was interested in was libraries, public libraries, institutions, cultural institutions. Hence we have Carnegie libraries, I think about 2,500, of which there were about, mostly in the States, about 500 or 600 in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and in Ireland about 65 or 6, which are still, of which about 60 still operate. And of course you have Carnegie Hall, etc., and other institutions like that. So the thinking was that local authorities would apply for grants to build libraries, and the Carnegie money would provide the capital for the actual building. There were a couple of important precursors to this potential development of libraries. Local authorities had to accept, or to what's the word I should use, accept the Public Libraries Act, which was there from the 19th century, and also to indicate that they were prepared to strike a rate in the pound. I mean, rates were struck obviously at the local level, and generally 1/2 penny perhaps. In Bray's case, I think 1 penny in the pound was set aside to fund the salary for the librarian, book fund, some maintenance, I suppose, and maybe cleaning services, whatever was necessary. It generated very, very little money, in fact, and I think even up to the period of the late 30s or early 40s, perhaps only about £300 in the case of Bray. But nevertheless, the philanthropism of Carnegie gave the opportunity, and that's really where many Irish library services stem from. The Carnegie system, the Carnegie Trust, and that's the foundation of what we have today. The role of men and women in the pre-war days was completely different, of course. I mean, women didn't have the vote, except in very limited circumstances related to property. There was a small reading room in the library in Bray for women, and indeed a lady who wrote to the library authority said that she wanted to read the Evening Herald, but it wasn't available in the women's reading room, where you probably got a gardening magazine, maybe some aspects of gossip or equivalent of whatever we call it, popular magazines of the day. And she wanted to read the evening paper, and she insisted on the paper being made available to her. She also observed that the librarian at the time, Mr. Burke, was probably keeping the Evening Herald for his own reading in the evening in any case. But even another item that I noted when I was looking at the early aspects of libraries and library development and staffing was that some library authorities they actually stipulated that only male candidates should apply, because it was considered that the supervisory roles that were necessary in busy reading rooms would not be suitable for women. Bray obviously employed a librarian, Bill Burke. Greystones, I think, on the contrary, I think the librarian was a woman actually, but one can see from the how the roles were in those days. Indeed, I think there was also a letter in the Bray file which said that the suffragette movement were anxious to know why their magazines at the time, the suffragette-related literature, wasn't stocked in the library. And obviously things changed to some extent, I suppose, after the war, But the reading rooms were largely, in many instances, where libraries were at. Although I've no doubt that for women, for instance, who came, in the busy lives they had, and hard-working lives in their home, domestically or at work, it was probably an opportunity to find some light reading just to pass maybe a half an hour in the evening. And I've heard that said, that sociologically that was how women, just to get something to take to escape maybe from the grind of daily lives for many of them. The book stock wasn't was weak enough. Although at the time, funny enough, in the earlier Carnegie libraries, the book stock is actually better, more eclectic, more contemporary than the book stock in later libraries, because censorship, as applied in the Irish state from about 1928 or 29 onwards, was not in place and was not, and hence there was a greater selection of literature and writing on available. The early Carnegie libraries did not really. The library in Bray fulfilled very little, I'd say, outside the role of a lending library in a small way, probably. I mean, the early lending figures are about 900 maybe a month. What's that? About 10,000 books in a year, perhaps. I mean, it wasn't until the 50s that lending went up to about 100,000. And there was no children's library in Bray, for instance, which meant that complete section of the population was excluded. I think you had to be over 15. It was probably kind of a forbidding place to some extent as well, because an aging Carnegie librarian who was by this stage living in the building, who had taken up residence in the 1920s, was probably running the place in a fairly authoritarian way. I mean, obviously, the issues around smoking, drinking, noise, all he had exercised complete control over those in those areas. Interestingly enough, I also believe that the newspapers in many of those libraries, to prevent them from being removed, were framed in a kind of a case where you could turn the page one at a time. I suppose you could tear a page out, but you couldn't actually remove the physical newspaper. But nothing much else in Bray, I'd say. Nevertheless, of course, they gave the opportunity for people to read a newspaper, keep up to date with the news of the day. We know how important that is today, actually. People are obsessed by almost what's going on. But at the same time, I mean, people would have liked to take their view, inform themselves. It was a what would you call it, faltering steps, or in progressing the areas that had developed in the 19th century from national schools. I mean, the whole, if you like, I mean, there was a huge desire among many people. And again, we have to remember the society was largely a male-dominated society, to improve themselves, in a sense, to actually improve their, to be able to read, to be able to engage with, if you like, to be able to look your better in the eye and say you can talk to him about something, So that meant that you had to be informed. And reading obviously played a huge role in that. I mean, for instance, in Bray, the librarian had to order extra newspapers when the First World War broke out in 1914, because more and more people came into the reading rooms. And that indicates that there was a demand for that. Of course, some people might look on the idea of free newspapers, but I mean, incomes were small. And indeed, one had to encourage the opportunity that it was good that more people were reading and more people engaged with reading. The lending section was necessarily, when I say necessarily, inevitably small, because of the fact that the rates, the monies were small. But there was obviously generally a fairly solid reference section, which would probably involve classics, maybe some Latin, some Greek, atlases, in the great Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance, from 1911, which is one of the most famous of all the issues of that book, which was thought to, a glory of the age, thought to contain almost everything that was known to humankind in science and philosophy in those areas. That was in Bray Library, and I've no doubt it would have been leafed through. So people could spend some time there, usefully engaging with classical literature, or indeed with, as I say, improving their knowledge of the world they lived in various ways. And that obviously was significant, because the libraries certainly were used. And there were charges, of course. Like, it might have been just a penny a week, but it had to be paid maybe 3 months in advance. That might be asking a lot of people who were on very limited sort of money. So it did deter, I'd say, some people from using libraries. And when I started in Bray, for instance, there were two charges. There was a local charge for people who lived within the Bray area, the urban area, and there was a slightly bigger charge for people who lived outside the area. I can't remember the details of it at the moment. It might have been a shilling inside and 2 and 6 outside, or at one stage 2 and 6 inside and 10 shillings outside. That kind of difference, distinction. That's all gone, of course. And Richard Barrington of Vassaro, who I think died in the First World War, in giving a cheque for £10, was said in a little note saying, "I am certain that libraries will contribute to education and development in this very competitive age." And that's from about 1910, which indicates that we're not just living in a competitive age today. All ages are competitive.